The condo he called home. The office lease his firm signed without blinking. The ski chalet in Mont Tremblant he booked every February, and somehow always got at a price that made his colleagues jealous. None of it was truly his, not in the way he believed. There is the silence of a man with nothing left to say. There is the silence of a man who has already made his decision and is simply waiting for the right moment to act. And then there is the silence I carried home from that Thanksgiving dinner, the kind that doesn't feel like quiet at all. It feels like the moment before the first snow, when the air holds itself still and everything that's coming is already certain. I am 63 years old. I built my career as a civil engineer for 22 years in Ontario, took early retirement at 54, and spent the decade that followed doing what I had always done, quietly working. Not in any office anyone could see. Not in any role my son could describe at a dinner party. I bought properties. I partnered with a small group of investors I'd known since university. I watched the GTA real estate market the way other men watch hockey, with patience and without sentiment. By the time my son was telling his colleagues that his father had sort of drifted into retirement, I was the silent partner behind a numbered company, 2847391, Ontario Incorporated, that held 7 residential units in Mississauga, 2 commercial leases in Oakville, and a stake in a small, mixed-use development just outside Burlington. My son knew none of this. I had never told him, and I realize now, sitting on the back porch of my place near Georgian Bay with a mug of coffee going cold beside me, that the not telling was its own kind of error. I wanted him to see a simple man. I wanted him to come to me as a father, not as a resource. What I created instead was a son who looked at a simple man and concluded he was a lesser one. His name is my name, I'll leave it at that. He is 37 years old, works as a financial analyst at a mid-size firm on Bay Street, and lives in a 2-bedroom condo in Liberty Village that he believes he acquired through exceptional credit and his own initiative. He is not a bad person. That's the part that makes it complicated. He is charming and intelligent and, in the right company, genuinely kind. But somewhere around his late 20s, after his mother remarried and moved to West Vancouver with a man who drove a black Range Rover and talked loudly about his portfolio, my son began to confuse presentation with substance. He began to measure people by their visible edges, what they drove, where they summered, what they said when someone asked what they did. I drove a 2017 Ford F-150. I summered at a modest cottage 40 minutes north of Barrie that I'd owned outright since 2009. When someone asked what I did, I said I was retired. He was embarrassed by me. He had been, I think, for several years. But I didn't understand the full depth of it until the second Sunday of October, around a table set for 11 people. My sister had hosted Thanksgiving that year, in her house in Ancaster. It was a good evening until it wasn't. The table was full, my sister and her husband, their 2 adult kids, my son and his wife, and, because my son had arranged it without consulting me, my ex-wife and her husband, a man I will refer to as her husband, because that is all he is to me. He sells commercial insurance. He wears his success the way some men wear cologne, too much of it, applied in the wrong places. The turkey was carved. The wine was poured. Her husband was talking about a golf trip to Scottsdale and a client dinner at Canoe Restaurant, and my son was nodding along with the particular eagerness of a man performing his own ambitions through someone else's story. I was eating. I had complimented my sister's stuffing twice, because it was genuinely good and because I had nothing else to contribute to a conversation about Scottsdale. That was when it happened. My son's wife leaned over to him and said something in a low voice. I caught the words, "he never," and "so different," and my son laughed in the way people laugh when they've been given permission to say what he'd been thinking. He didn't lower his voice. I don't know if he forgot I was sitting 4 feet away, or if, in that moment, he simply didn't care. He never really figured it out, he said. Never had the ambition for it. Some people are just comfortable coasting. He was talking about me. Everyone at the table knew it. My sister looked at her plate. Her husband took a long drink of his wine. Her husband, the one in from Vancouver, smiled into his glass in a way that suggested he agreed, and was pleased to agree, and had perhaps been waiting for someone else to say it first. I did not put down my fork. I did not raise my voice. I looked at my son, who was still half smiling, still basking in the warmth of what he thought was a clever observation, and I said nothing. I chewed. I swallowed. I asked my niece how her semester was going. My son interpreted my silence as confirmation. That much was clear from the way he settled back into his chair, comfortable, unchallenged, satisfied. In his mind, a man who doesn't defend himself has nothing to defend. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. I drove home on the 400 that night with the radio off. Not because I was angry, I had moved past anger somewhere near Barry, but because I needed to think cleanly. I am an engineer by training. I do not act on feeling. I act on assessment. And what I was assessing, calmly and without drama, was the full picture of what I had quietly built around my son's life without his awareness. Like a load-bearing wall he'd been leaning against for years, not knowing it was there. The condo first. When my son bought his place in Liberty Village 4 years ago, the deal had been straightforward on the surface. He'd qualified for the mortgage on his own income, which was real and sufficient. But the deposit $62,000 had come from me, structured as a private loan through a family trust I'd established years earlier. There was a promissory note. There was a repayment schedule he had paid precisely twice before life, as he put it, got complicated. The outstanding balance, with the modest interest rate I had never once charged him, was still $54,000. Legally and clearly documented. The car next. His wife drove a 2022 Honda CR-V, leased through a dealership in Etobicoke. The lease had been co-signed by me at her request. Her credit had a gap from a period of self-employment, and they had needed a guarantor. The monthly payments came out of their account, reliably enough. The co-signature was mine, and what a co-signature means, in practical terms, is that I have standing. I had options. Then the thing he didn't know about at all. The firm where my son worked, a mid-size financial analysis group with offices in the Exchange Tower, rented 2 floors of a building in which I held a minority stake through 2847391 Ontario Incorporated. Not a controlling stake, but a documented one, and the building's property manager was a man named Douglas, who had been my contact in 3 separate investments over 8 years, and who owed me more professional courtesies than he had ever had reason to repay. I am not a vengeful man. I want to be clear about that, because what came next was not about punishment. It was about accuracy. My son had constructed a version of reality in which I was a mild, unremarkable man who had drifted through his working years and landed softly in retirement, propped up by nothing in particular. The entire architecture of that belief was built on my own silence. I had withheld the truth for reasons I thought were generous. The result was a son who had learned to mistake my generosity for invisibility. I was going to give him accuracy, not rage, not speeches, just facts, delivered in sequence, without apology. I called my lawyer the Monday after Thanksgiving. Her name is Patricia, and she has handled my affairs for 11 years. I explained what I needed. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "You're certain?" I told her I was. She said she would prepare the documentation. I called Douglas the following Thursday. We spoke for 12 minutes. He was, as I expected, cooperative, without requiring explanation. The first letter went to my son's firm, not to my son. It was a formal communication from the property management company, advising that certain lease renewal terms would be subject to review given a change in stakeholder priorities. It was not a termination notice. It was not threatening. It was the kind of letter that gets forwarded up the chain, that prompts a quiet inquiry to HR, that causes a mid-level financial analyst to wonder, for the first time, whether his office situation is as stable as he assumed. I was told, through Douglas, that it generated exactly the kind of internal meeting I anticipated. The second step was the promissory note. Patricia sent a formal demand letter, registered mail. Return receipt to my son's Liberty Village address, referencing the family trust, the original loan documentation, and the outstanding balance of $54,000. The letter was courteous and precise. It requested repayment within 60 days and included information about the legal remedies available in the event of non-compliance. The third step was the co-signature. I contacted the leasing company directly, explained that my personal financial circumstances had changed in ways that made my continued role as guarantor untenable, and submitted the appropriate request to be removed from the agreement. Under the lease terms, this triggered a review of the co-signer arrangement. My son's wife received a letter within 10 days, advising that the guarantor change request was under review and requesting updated financial documentation from the primary lessee. She would not have understood immediately what it meant, but she would have felt the ground shift. I did not call my son. I did not email him. I did not reach out through my sister or send any message that could be interpreted as a desire for conflict. I went about my days. I drove to the hardware store in Collingwood. I had dinner with an old colleague who was visiting from Kingston. I raked the leaves around the cottage and watched the lake go gray and still the way it does every October when the season finally decides it's done. My son called me on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the Thanksgiving dinner. I let it go to voicemail. His message was controlled. He was trying, I could tell, to sound casual, but there was an edge underneath it. The edge of a man who has started pulling at a thread and found it connected to more than he expected. He said he'd received some paperwork and wanted to touch base when I had a moment. I called him back the following Saturday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and a view of the water. He started with the promissory note. He said he'd been meaning to address the loan, that things had been tight with the mortgage and the cost of living in Toronto being what it was, that he hadn't realized the family trust was something that generated formal demand letters. His tone was careful, conciliatory. I let him speak without interrupting. Then he mentioned the property management letter his firm had received. He didn't ask me directly if I was connected to it. He circled around it, the way someone does when they suspect something but can't quite bring themselves to name it. "The building your company is in," I said. Silence. "The Exchange Tower property. I hold a stake in it through a numbered company. I've held it for about 6 years." More silence. "A different kind." "The management letter was a routine communication," I said. "Nothing has been decided, but I thought you should know the context." He said, very quietly, "I didn't know that." "There's quite a bit you didn't know," I said. "I made a choice not to tell you. I thought I was protecting something, the relationship, maybe. The idea that you were coming to me as a son rather than as someone who needed something. I think I got that wrong." He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had changed. The Bay Street composure was gone. What was underneath it was younger and smaller and more familiar to me than anything I'd heard from him in years. "How much?" he started, and then stopped. "How long have you been doing this?" "The properties, the investments." "Since the year after I retired," I said. "About 9 years. Another pause. "And you never said anything?" "No." "Why?" I thought about that for a moment. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I wanted to give him the right one. Because I wanted you to think well of me for who I was, not what I had. And I think what happened instead is that you decided who I was based on what you could see, which wasn't much. He didn't have anything to say to that. I didn't push. I told him the promissory note was real and would need to be addressed in the timeline specified. I told him Patricia would be the point of contact for any questions about the documentation. I told him the situation with his firm's lease was not something I was prepared to weaponize, but that he should understand my involvement existed and that I would expect, going forward, a baseline of honesty between us about what was real and what wasn't. I said, "The way you spoke at your aunt's table. About me. In front of your uncle and your cousins and your mother's husband." He said, "Dad, I'm not asking you to apologize," I said. "I'm asking you to understand that the man you described, the one who coasted, who never figured it out, that man built the floor you've been standing on. I don't want credit for it. I want you to know it was there." He said something then that I hadn't expected. He said, "I think I've known something was off for a long time. You were always too calm, too unbothered. I told myself it was because you didn't care." "I cared," I said. "I just didn't show it the way you were watching for." We talked for another 40 minutes. I won't reproduce all of it because some of it belongs only to the two of us. But I will say that by the end of it, he sounded like the boy I remembered from when he was young, uncertain, and earnest, and genuinely trying to understand something that had been in front of him without his realizing it. That boy had never gone anywhere. He'd just been wearing a different costume for 15 years. It was late that same evening when my phone rang a second time. It was my ex-wife. I had not spoken to her directly in close to 2 years, not since a brief and civil exchange at our nephew's graduation. We had managed the post-divorce years with the particular Canadian politeness of two people who once shared a life and now share only history cordial at family events, non-existent everywhere else. She had moved to West Vancouver with her husband the year after they married. He was, by all appearances, doing well. The Range Rover, the Scottsdale golf trips, the dinner at Canoe. Her voice when she called was not the voice I associated with West Vancouver and black Range Rovers. It was tight and clipped and high in the way voices get when the body is moving faster than the words. She said she needed to tell me something, and that she was telling me as a courtesy, because I deserved to know. She had found out that week through her accountant, of all people, that her husband had been carrying a level of personal debt that she had not been aware of. The presentation of success, it turned out, had been maintained by a combination of a line of credit tied to their property, a second line he had not disclosed, and a refinancing decision made 2 years earlier that had quietly depleted what she believed was their investment portfolio. She was not calling to ask for anything. She was very clear about that. She was calling because my son had apparently called her that afternoon after speaking with me and said something that prompted her to have a conversation with her husband that she probably should have had years earlier. The conversation had not gone the way she hoped. I listened. I did not say I told you so, because I hadn't told her anything. I did not express satisfaction, because what she was describing, a woman in her early 60s realizing that the ground beneath her was not what she had believed, was not something I could feel satisfied about. I had been in that place, just from a different direction. I said, "I'm sorry. That's a hard thing to find out." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You always were more solid than you looked." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just said, "Take care of yourself. Call your accountant first, before anything else." She said, "Thank you." We said goodbye. I set the phone down on the kitchen table and sat for a while without moving. Outside the window, the lake was dark and absolutely still. The kind of still it only gets in late October, when the last of the summer people have gone home and the birds have mostly cleared out, and the only sound is the occasional creak of the dock and whatever's moving in the tree line. There is a specific quality of quiet in that part of Ontario at that time of year that I have never been able to describe accurately to anyone who hasn't sat in it. It is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of something that doesn't need sound to be understood. I thought about my son. I thought about the version of me he had built in his mind, the mild, contented retiree who had drifted past ambition and found his level. And I thought about how much of that version I had actually handed him, piece by piece, by choosing silence over truth for years at a time. I don't regret the silence entirely. There is value in not making your children feel like they owe you their gratitude. But there is a cost to it too, and that cost had come due at a Thanksgiving table in Ancaster on a Sunday in October. I had not done what I did to punish him. I want to be honest about that, with myself as much as anyone. The promissory note was always there. The co-signature situation was always a live document. My stake in the Exchange Tower property had nothing to do with my son's employment, and everything to do with a decision I'd made 6 years ago about where to put capital. What I had done was simply stop maintaining the arrangement where all of that remained invisible. I had let the real picture become visible. That is different from building a trap. Whether my son would see it that way, whether, over time, he would understand the difference between revelation and retaliation, I didn't know yet. What I knew was that the conversation we'd had that morning was the most honest one we'd shared in close to a decade. He had asked real questions. I had given him real answers. That was more than I had managed to do in years of careful, considerate distance. I made a second coffee. I sat back down at the kitchen table. The loan would be repaid. He had already said he would arrange it, and I believed him. Patricia would handle the mechanics. The co-signature situation would resolve itself through whatever process the leasing company had established for exactly this kind of review. The commercial lease for his firm was not something I intended to interfere with. Douglas and I had spoken about that directly. I had no interest in my son losing his position at his company. I had interest in my son knowing who his father was. There is a particular kind of peace that comes not from winning but from being accurately seen. I had chased that for a long time without knowing what to call it. My son had looked at me across a dinner table and declared me a man who had never figured it out, and the sting of it had not been anger. Exactly, it had been the grief of being known only by your most deliberately underplayed surface. He had seen the truck and the cottage and the quiet retirement and concluded there was nothing underneath. And I had given him every reason to conclude exactly that. Being accurately seen means they see the whole thing. The truck and the cottage and the numbered company. The early mornings, reading the land registry. The patience required to wait for the right development partner. The satisfaction, quiet, private, not requiring an audience of having built something real, while everyone around you assumed you were coasting. All of it. The surface and what was underneath it. My son had not asked me, even once, in 9 years, what I did with my days. He had assumed the answer was nothing of consequence, and I had let him. That was our agreement. Unspoken, not quite fair to either of us. And it had finally collapsed under its own weight on a Sunday in October, over turkey and my sister's stuffing, and a glass of whatever the man from Vancouver had brought. I picked up the phone and sent my son a message. 3 sentences. I told him that I thought we had more to talk about when he was ready, that there was no timeline and no pressure, and that I had always been proud of who he was becoming, even when I didn't say it the way he needed to hear it. He responded about an hour later with a message that was shorter than mine and had a typo in it, which told me he had written it quickly and not gone back to polish it, which told me it was real. We would have more dinners. There would be uncomfortable afternoons and topics that needed more time than a single phone call. He would need to reconcile the version of his father he had built with the version that had just come into view. And that reconciliation doesn't happen cleanly or all at once. Neither does anything that matters. But something had changed, something foundational. The lake outside was still dark, and the coffee had gone cold again, and I didn't bother getting up to reheat it. There are nights when it's enough to just sit with what has happened and not try to shape it into anything more than what it is. A conversation. A reckoning. A long overdue introduction between a father and a son who had been misreading each other for years. I am 63 years old. I have 7 residential units in Mississauga, and a stake in a small development near Burlington, and a cottage I own outright, and a truck that runs fine, and a son who, as of last Saturday morning, finally knows what his father does. That's enough. For tonight, that's more than enough.